Imagine a population shifting so dramatically and so rapidly that it completely rewrites the economic future of the entire globe.
Right.
Usually when we talk about a demographic shift, there is this expectation of a very slow, almost imperceptible evolution.
Yeah, like a glacier moving.
Exactly. A birth rate dips a little bit in one region, or, life expectancy nudges up a few months in another.
Hmm.
And over the course of a century, a society looks slightly older. It's gradual, and it's comforting in a way because we like things to be predictable. But then you step into the world of developing economies, entering a very specific stage of growth, and suddenly that slow evolution becomes an avalanche.
It really does.
We are looking at a demographic landscape that is basically fundamentally restructuring human civilization right under our feet.
It is the absolute definition of a seismic demographic event.
Yeah.
I mean, it's happening right now, shaping the global markets of tomorrow, and yet it often flies completely under the radar in everyday conversation.
Totally.
We tend to focus on the daily market tickers, and we completely miss the tectonic plates shifting beneath them.
And that is exactly why we are here with you today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a massive demographic and economic phenomenon occurring right now in developing nations, specifically those in what economists call the early demographic dividend stage,
Right.
or you might see it abbreviated as EAR.
Yeah, ER. And to really understand the sheer gravity and scale of this, we are pulling from a remarkably detailed 15-page comprehensive research report.
It's a heavy one.
It is. It's titled Capturing the Growth Window: Comprehensive Evolution and Challenges of the Early Demographic Dividend Stage. And it's doing something incredibly ambitious. It's tracking the evolution of these economies through a multidimensional lens.
Right, and it's not just, theoretical postulating here. This report is backed by an incredibly extensive stack of World Bank data.
Massive amounts of data.
Yeah, we are talking about tracking these specific economies and their populations from 1960 all the way to 2023.
The huge time span.
So our mission for this deep dive is to decode exactly what this demographic window of opportunity actually is. We want to understand how it is physically reshaping global economics, how it's driving an absolute explosion in urbanization, what it is doing to the environment, and crucially, what these countries absolutely must do before this window inevitably slams shut.
Because it will shut.
It always does. So, okay, let's unpack this. What exactly makes a country an EAR economy?
Well, to understand the early demographic dividend, or ER, we have to look closely at the structural makeup of a population.
Okay.
Specifically, the ratio of people who are in their productive working years versus the people who are not. So a demographic dividend happens when a country enters a highly strategic temporary window where the percentage of its working age population,
Which is what age range?
usually defined as people between the ages of 15 and 64. So that percentage rises significantly while the share of its dependents falls.
Got it.
Dependents being children under 15 and the elderly over 65.
Let me stop you there for a second, though, because the word dividend usually means like a financial payout.
Right.
Like, I own a stock, the company makes a profit, I get a dividend check. Why are economists applying Wall Street terminology to human beings?
That is a fantastic question, and it goes right to the heart of the mechanism. Think of a population's age structure as an investment.
Okay.
For decades, many of these developing nations had incredibly high birth rates. They were investing heavily in raising children.
Right, big families.
Exactly. That meant a massive base of dependents who consumed resources, food, healthcare, education, but weren't yet producing economic value.
Makes sense.
But as healthcare slowly improved and infant mortality dropped, families realized they didn't need to have 6 children to ensure a few survived to adulthood. So birth rates began to transition downward.
So you have this huge generation of kids that were already born during the high birth rate era.
Precisely. That massive base of kids eventually grows up and crosses the threshold into the 15 to 64 working age bracket. And at the exact same time, because birth rates have started falling, there are far fewer new babies being born behind them to take their place as dependents.
And I imagine the elderly population hasn't boomed yet because life expectancy, while improving, takes a long time to catch up to Western levels.
Exactly. So you get this bulge in the middle.
It's a huge working class.
Right, this massive, unprecedented surge of people right in their prime productive years with relatively few children to feed below them and relatively few elderly parents to care for above them.
Wow.
That is the dividend, the payout. The society is finally reaping the economic reward of that massive earlier generation. And the scale of this payout, when you look at the World Bank data, is just staggering.
I was looking at those numbers.
Yeah, in 1960, the total population in these year regions was roughly 969 million people. Fast forward to 2022, that number skyrocketed to a massive 3.55 billion.
3.55 billion people. Just, to wrap your head around that for a second. That is almost half the planet's current population, concentrated just in these specific developing economies moving through this window.
And within that 3.55 billion, the shift in who is actually doing the work is profound.
Right.
The working age population climbed from 55.3% in 1960 to over 66% today.
Wow.
That is a 10.7% increase in the raw share of the population that is physically capable of working, producing, and earning.
Which means the intense pressure of simply trying to keep people fed is finally lifting. I was looking at the dependency ratios in the data you brought, and this completely blew my mind.
It's dramatic.
It really is. The child dependency ratio, which is the number of children compared to the working age population, it plummeted. It was over 75% in the 1960s.
Yeah.
That means for every 4 working age adults, there were 3 kids to support. Every single adult was stretched incredibly thin. But by 2022, that ratio dropped to just 41.3%. That is a massive 33.7% drop. Meanwhile, the elderly dependency ratio has only crept up very slowly, from 5.8% to 10%.
Which creates what economists recognize as a unique, highly temporary economic vacuum. It is a moment of pure potential energy.
So let's try to visualize how this actually translates into money, because percentages can get kind of abstract.
Here.
If I think about a single family in one of these countries in the 1960s versus today, well, in the 60s, a young couple might have 4 or 5 kids. If they are making, say, the equivalent of $100 a month, every single penny of that $100 goes immediately out the door just to buy enough rice, basic clothing, and shelter to keep those kids alive.
Right, there's no saving.
Right. It is pure survival. There is no surplus.
Exactly. The entirety of the nation's labor is instantly converted into survival consumption.
But fast forward to today, that same couple, because of the shifting demographics, maybe only has 2 kids. They are still making $100, but it only costs them $60 to feed and clothe their 2 kids.
Yes.
Suddenly, they have $40 left over at the end of the month. I kind of call this the survival release. The pressure of survival is released, and suddenly they have surplus cash.
I like that term.
Thanks. But here's where I get tripped up. If 1 billion families suddenly have an extra $40 in a jar under their bed, how does that actually build a multi-billion-dollar national highway system or a high-tech port? How does family savings turn into macroeconomic power?
What's fascinating here is the unseen mechanism of capital accumulation.
Okay.
You are entirely right that money sitting in a jar under a bed does nothing for a nation's GDP. But that isn't what happens. As societies stabilize, that survival release surplus moves from the jar under the bed into the local banking system. Families open savings accounts.
Oh, okay, so the local banks suddenly have a massive influx of deposits.
Yes. And banks do not just hold money, they lend it.
Right.
When millions of families deposit their newfound surplus, the national banking system suddenly has immense liquidity. They can now issue massive loans to developers, to corporations, and to the government.
Ah, I see.
So the developer takes that loan and builds a factory. The government takes that loan and pays a highway or lays fiber optic cables. The demographic dividend allows a country to finally transition from a desperate survival economy to a strategic investment economy.
That makes incredible sense. They are literally pooling the unspent child-rearing money to pour concrete and build power grids.
Precisely.
The demographic shift funds the very infrastructure needed to employ the demographic shift, which is a perfect segue, actually, because if they have this pooled money and it is sitting in the national banking system, we have to look at what they are actually buying with it.
Right.
How is this capital physically altering the landscape of these nations?
Well, to understand the physical alteration, we first have to look at the sheer velocity of the wealth being created. The macro growth numbers in the report are just astounding.
Yeah.
The adjusted net national income in these IRG countries expanded nearly 4 times over.
Wait, stop right there. Adjusted net national income. If we are going to dive into this, you have to translate the economist speak for me. What does that actually measure?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So think of gross domestic product, or GDP, as the total value of everything a country produces.
Sure.
But GDP can be misleading because it doesn't account for things like the depletion of natural resources or the wear and tear on machinery.
Okay.
Adjusted net national income is a much more grounded metric. It takes the total income of the nation, adds in money sent home from citizens working abroad, and then subtracts the depreciation of assets and the depletion of natural resources.
Oh, I see.
It is essentially asking, after accounting for the wear and tear on our country, how much actual usable wealth did we generate this year?
Got it. It's the actual take-home pay of the country, not just the gross revenue.
Right.
So what happened to their take-home pay?
It exploded. I mean,
Yeah.
we were talking about growing from $2.5 trillion in the 1970s to nearly $10 trillion in 2021.
10
And importantly, the World Bank calculates this using constant 2015 US dollars, which means this growth is adjusted for inflation. It is real, tangible wealth. $10 trillion of wealth basically willed into existence by this demographic engine.
That is just wild. And what absolutely staggered me in the data was the resilience of this wealth. We all lived through the global shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. The report clearly shows the severe impact in 2020. The economic growth rate in these regions plunged to negative 6.66%.
Yeah, huge hit.
A brutal, grinding contraction that hurt a lot of people.
It was a devastating halt to the global supply chain, and developing nations felt it acutely.
But then look at the very next year. In 2021, we see a highly resilient rebound, bouncing back with a positive 5.8% growth rate.
Incredible bounce back.
You don't bounce back that fast after a historic global shutdown unless the underlying fundamentals of your economy are incredibly robust.
No.
But where is all this happening? Because $10 trillion isn't being generated on subsistence farms.
No, definitely not. And this is the physical transformation you asked about. We are witnessing the great urban migration, the shift from an agrarian reality to an industrialized, city-based reality.
Right.
The urban population share vaulted from 22.6% in 1960 to 47.3% in 2022.
Just, stop and think about that number. That represents over 1.5 billion new city dwellers, 1.5 billion people packing up their lives, leaving the rural villages of their ancestors, and moving to urban centers to fuel the service and manufacturing sectors.
It is arguably the largest physical migration of humanity in the history of the world, happening over just a few decades.
But here's where I have to push back a bit, because the report frames this urbanization as a triumph, and it comes with huge infrastructure wins. The data highlights that urban electricity access in these regions has reached a staggering 95.7%.
Almost universal power in the cities.
Right. But I watch the news. When we see massive, rapid urbanization in the developing world, it isn't always gleaming skyscrapers. Often it's sprawling slums, horrific traffic gridlock, and overwhelmed sanitation systems.
That's true.
Millions moving to cities creates an instant consumer class, sure, but it also creates immense human suffering if the city isn't ready. Is this extreme urbanization the actual cause of the $10 trillion economic boom, or is it just a messy symptom of desperate people leaving the farms?
That is a crucial distinction to make. It is both, actually, but structurally. Urbanization acts as what we might call the density engine.
The density engine.
Right. It fundamentally rewrites how consumption and production operate. When you have people spread out over thousands of miles in rural agrarian settings, economic exchange is incredibly slow. A farmer might buy goods once a week, but density, putting millions of people in close proximity, creates an intense velocity of money.
Velocity of money meaning how fast a single dollar bill changes hands.
Exactly. In a dense city, a worker buys coffee in the morning, the barista uses that money to take a bus, the bus driver uses it to buy lunch, the restaurant owner pays a supplier.
It just keeps moving.
Yes. That single dollar fuels 4 economic transactions in a day. You have restaurants, retail, banking, and logistics all feeding off each other. Density allows for the rapid rise of the service sector. You simply cannot have a bustling tech repair shop or a specialized medical clinic if your nearest neighbor is 3 miles away.
So the city itself is the machine that generates the wealth, even if the living conditions inside the machine are still struggling to catch up.
Yes, and the data warns us about exactly that tension. While the total macroeconomic size has ballooned to $10 trillion, the report explicitly notes that per capita growth, the actual wealth divided by the number of people, faces ongoing volatility.
Ah, I see. Meaning the pie got way bigger, but there are so many more people crowding around the table that the slice each individual person gets isn't necessarily growing as fast as we'd hope.
Precisely. The total wealth is skyrocketing. But it isn't trickling down efficiently to the individual worker yet.
Right.
The infrastructure is racing to keep up, as we see with that 95.7% urban electricity access, but wealth distribution remains a severe bottleneck. The cities are generating the $10 trillion, but not every city dweller is feeling it in their pocket.
Which leads us perfectly into what I think is the most glaring contradiction in this entire 15-page report. If you are listening to this on your commute or at home, picture this. We see the $10 trillion and we see the 1.5 billion people migrating to the cities. It sounds like a total societal transformation.
On surface, yes.
But if we grab a magnifying glass and look closely at what these 3.55 billion people actually do for a living from 9 to 5, the numbers tell a really confusing, almost contradictory story.
You were referring to the sector-labor mismatch.
Yes, the mismatch. Okay, so the shift in where the money comes from is very clear. Agricultural value added to the economy absolutely plummeted. It went from making up 30.6% of the entire economy in 1990 down to roughly 10% today.
A massive drop.
Huge. The service sector is now absolutely dominant, with annual growth rates previously breaking the 10% mark. So financially speaking, the economy is no longer an agricultural one. The money is in services and manufacturing.
The financial value has successfully de-agriculturalized. That is correct.
But here's where it makes zero sense to me. Despite agriculture only making up about 10% of the economic value, the World Bank data shows it still absorbs a massive 33.9% of the total workforce.
It's a striking imbalance.
Think about the physical reality of that. 10% of the money is supporting over 33% of the people. Meanwhile, manufacturing employment, which is historically supposed to be the great stepping stone to middle-class wealth, has grown very slowly. So it's at only 16.9% of the workforce.
Right.
If the farm only generates a dime on the dollar, why is a third of the country still standing out in the field?
It is a profound structural lag, and it reveals the harsh reality of rapid development. What you are seeing is an economy that successfully shifted its wealth to the cities, but completely failed to build enough urban jobs to absorb its massive new population.
Ah.
I like to think of that 33.9% agricultural workforce as the great waiting room of the developing economy.
A great waiting room. I like that. Explain how that works.
Well, migrating to a city and securing a job in a formal service or manufacturing role requires a baseline of skills, mobility, and social opportunity that isn't universally available.
Okay.
If the factories in the service sector aren't scaling fast enough to absorb the millions of youth entering the workforce every single year, those youth have no choice but to stay on the family farm.
So they're just stuck.
Yes. Agriculture, especially subsistence farming, acts as the ultimate sponge for surplus human labor. They aren't highly productive, they aren't adding much to the national GDP, but they are eating. They are surviving.
Yeah.
It is a form of hidden unemployment. They're waiting for the modern economy to build a door they can walk through.
Subsistence farming as a massive countrywide safety net because the factory boom stalled out. That is a sobering way to look at it.
Very much so.
But as shocking as that mismatch is, there is another gap in this labor data that is even more alarming and frankly a lot more intentional: the gender chasm.
Yes. If you want to identify the most critical vulnerability in the entire early demographic dividend model, this is it.
The numbers here are just stark. Male labor force participation in these EAR countries is incredibly robust. It sits at around 79.4%.
Almost 80%.
Right. Basically, if you are a working-age man, you are likely in the labor force. But female participation is drastically low, sitting at only about 35%.
Barely over a third.
And it gets so much worse when you look at the quality of the jobs. Of the women who are working, the report notes that 63.6% of them are trapped in what the World Bank officially classifies as vulnerable employment.
That classification is vital to understand. Vulnerable employment means jobs without formal contracts, without Social Security, without safety nets.
It's just totally informal.
Yes. It means street vendors, informal domestic workers, unpaid family laborers.
Let's make that real for the listener. Vulnerable employment means if you get sick on a Tuesday, you simply don't eat on Wednesday.
Exactly.
There is no HR department, no sick leave, no legal protection. You are entirely at the mercy of the daily grind. So less than 4 in 10 women are even in the workforce, and of those 4, more than 2 are in highly precarious, informal, unprotected jobs.
This is a huge issue.
If you are trying to build an economic superpower and transition your country into wealth, why on earth would you leave half your team on the bench?
It is institutional self-sabotage. This is why I stress that the demographic dividend cannot be fully realized if half the population is sidelined.
Right.
The entire premise of the ear stage, the whole reason the wealth generates, is maximizing the output of your working age population while dependency is low.
That's the whole point.
Exactly. But if you systematically exclude 65% of your working age women from formal labor, the math falls apart. The so-called gender dividend remains largely unexploited in these regions, representing trillions of dollars in lost potential.
Which brings us to the obvious question. If I'm a policymaker looking at this data, how do I fix it? If millions of young men are stuck in the great waiting room of low-yield agriculture and millions of women are locked out of the formal economy entirely, the only way out is through human capital.
Correct.
You have to upgrade the people. How are these countries doing when it comes to skilling up and protecting their booming populations?
This is actually where the data provides some of the most optimistic reading in the entire report.
Okay, good news for once.
Yes. The foundational investments in human machinery have been quite miraculous over the last few decades.
The education numbers alone are a quantum leap. Let's look at adult female literacy. In these regions, it rose from a dismal 36.9% to 77.1%.
Huge jump.
That is a societal transformation in a single generation, going from a society where the vast majority of women cannot read a contract or a warning label to a society where nearly 80% can.
It changes everything.
And for the youth. The gender parity index for literacy is basically solved. It sits at 0.99, which is statistically indistinguishable from 1.0. Young girls are reading and writing at the exact same rate as young boys.
And it isn't just about getting kids into a room and hoping they learn. The operational quality of the education is showing signs of real structural improvement. The primary pupil-to-teacher ratio dropped from 35.9 students per teacher down to 27.9.
As someone who has tried to command the attention of a room full of kids, dropping from 36 students to 28 is the difference between pure crowd control and actual teaching.
Precisely. Smaller classes usually mean better engagement, and we see this reflected directly in the repetition rates, the number of kids held back to repeat a grade.
Okay.
That dropped drastically from 14% to roughly 4.9%. The educational pipeline is becoming much more efficient. They're moving kids through the system successfully.
And the health miracles. Under 5 child mortality dropped from 109.9 deaths per thousand down to roughly 24.5.
Incredible.
That is a 77% reduction in child tragedy. Life expectancy has steadily crossed the 70-year threshold. Maternal mortality has seen a significant drop, down to roughly 104 per 100,000. It is incredible progress.
It really is.
But as with all things in economics, there is a financial catch here that caught my eye. The cost of this health.
Yes, the out-of-pocket metrics reveal an interesting paradox in the development journey.
Right. The report shows that while private medical spending as a percentage of total health expenditure dropped from 53% to 45%, meaning governments are taking on a larger share of the burden, which is great, the absolute out-of-pocket costs for individuals are still rising.
It's confusing at first glance.
Wait, if health is getting better and the government is paying a higher percentage of the bill, why are individual citizens still paying more cash out of their own pockets?
Because of the nature of advanced medical care. As a country develops from a low-income to a middle-income economy, the baseline of care changes.
Okay.
50 years ago, medical care might have meant basic sanitation and a few simple antibiotics. Cheap, but limited. Today, those same countries have access to MRIs, complex surgeries, and chronic disease management.
So the treatments are just way more expensive.
Exactly. The treatments available become vastly more sophisticated and therefore vastly more expensive. The government is paying a larger slice of the pie, but the pie itself, the total cost of modern healthcare, is growing so fast that the individual's 45% slice still costs more in absolute dollars than their 53% slice did 20 years ago.
That is a fascinating paradox. The better the healthcare gets, the more it squeezes the average citizen's wallet.
Yes.
But I want to pivot back to education because I am still hung up on a massive discrepancy here. We just established that youth education is basically equal between boys and girls now. The parity index is 0.99. They're reading at the same rate.
Correct.
So if the girls are getting the exact same foundational skills as the boys, why is female labor participation still stuck at 35%? Why isn't this educational triumph translating into workforce integration? Where is the disconnect?
This highlights the friction between economic data and social reality. I call this phenomenon the paper promise.
The paper promise.
Yes. A society can promise equality on paper by providing equal access to schooling. But there is almost always a delayed, painful reaction between educational achievements and labor market inclusion. You cannot simply educate a young woman, hand her a diploma, and expect the labor market to absorb her if the surrounding societal infrastructure hasn't evolved with her.
Social infrastructure. Give me an example of what is holding her back if her education isn't the problem.
Primarily, deeply entrenched patriarchal norms regarding gender roles, where women are still expected to be the primary or sole caregivers regardless of their educational attainment.
That makes sense.
But even more practically, it is severe lack of childcare infrastructure. Let's look at the physical reality of the density engine we discussed earlier.
The urban cities.
Right. If a modern urbanizing economy requires a worker to commute across a massive city to be at a factory or an office for 10 hours a day, but there is no affordable, safe childcare available in that city, the mother is forced out of the labor pool.
Wow, yeah.
The education is there, the capability is there, but the structural bridge to the workplace is broken. The diploma becomes a paper promise.
So they get the education, they are ready to contribute to that $10 trillion economy, but they hit an invisible wall the moment they try to enter the formal workforce. That is incredibly frustrating.
It is. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, there's a looming shadow over all these health and education gains we just celebrated.
Oh.
We marveled at the fact that life expectancy has steadily crossed the 70-year threshold, which is without question a triumph of human public health. But mathematically, within the strict logic of the early demographic dividend, it introduces a ticking clock.
How so?
Think back to the very beginning of our discussion. The entire economic boom is based on having a massive working-age population and very few dependents.
Right.
But as life expectancy pushes past 70, that currently low elderly dependency ratio of 10% is going to start climbing. The window of having very few elderly dependents is closing precisely because the health systems are succeeding in keeping people alive longer.
Oh, wow. Because they live to 70 and beyond, they eventually exit the workforce and become dependents again. The very success of the healthcare system is what eventually ends the economic boom.
Exactly.
That is a heavy realization. And speaking of the toll of progress, we have established the rapid growth, the urbanization, the human capital gains. But industrializing a population of 3.55 billion people doesn't happen in a vacuum.
It certainly does not.
Keeping 3.5 billion people alive, moving them to cities, building hospitals, running factories, that takes power. And I'm guessing it is not all running on wind turbines and solar panels. What is this progress costing the planet, and who is actually managing the steering wheel of these nations?
These are the environmental and governance metrics, and they represent the ultimate constraints on the growth engine. Let's look at the environmental toll first.
The carbon pressure here is intense. The data shows that total CO2 emissions in these air regions have grown by roughly 21% compared to 1990.
Significant jump.
The report notes that the main culprits driving this are industrial combustion, which makes sense. That's the factories and manufacturing and building energy use.
Yep.
Again, if you are moving 1.5 billion people into cities, you have to build millions of apartment complexes, office buildings, and hospitals, and you have to heat and cool them. And underneath all of this progress, fossil fuels remain highly dominant, maintaining a 60+% share of all energy use.
It's an undeniably carbon-intensive pathway to prosperity.
No, I want to navigate this impartially because we are touching on what is arguably the ultimate global tension of our era.
It's a huge debate.
It is. If you are listening to this from a fully developed Western nation, it is very easy to look at that 21% increase in CO2 and demand these countries stop polluting. But the data lays bare a massive moral and economic dilemma. The desperate need for developing nations to pull literally billions of their citizens out of extreme poverty through industrialization versus the immense global pressure to transition to green energy to mitigate climate change. Historically, every single developed nation in the West utilized cheap, dirty, carbon-intensive energy to build their foundational wealth over the last century.
The data is unequivocal on that point. The carbon-to-growth link is still deeply entrenched in these early and middle stages of industrialization.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, these ERI nations are essentially attempting to replicate the historic wealth-building process of the developed world, but they are doing it at a historical moment when the global environmental tolerance for that specific pathway is entirely exhausted.
It's a tough spot.
It is an incredibly difficult needle to thread for policymakers. They absolutely need to sustain that $10 trillion economic engine to survive and develop, but relying on a 60% share of fossil fuels to get there carries immense compounding long-term global risks.
Right. And managing incredibly complex, high-stakes risks like a national energy transition requires incredible leadership and administration. Which brings us to the governance data. The World Bank uses a metric called the CPIA ratings, country policy, and institutional assessment.
Yes, graded on a scale of 1 to 6.
Before we look at the scores, explain to me like I'm 5. How does the World Bank actually measure if a government is doing a quote-unquote good job?
It's a rigorous process.
Because if I am a global investor or even just a citizen paying taxes, I need to know if my money is going to build a new hospital or if it is going to buy a corrupt provincial mayor a new yacht. How does CPIA capture that?
The CPIA evaluates 16 different criteria, looking at economic management, structural policies, policies for social inclusion, and public sector management. It relies on extensive surveys, audits, and on-the-ground assessments by World Bank experts to judge the actual quality of a country's institutional framework. It isn't just asking, do you have a law against corruption? It asks, when we audit this highway project, did the funds reach the contractors? Was the bidding process open? And can the public see the ledger?
Okay, that makes sense. So looking at the scores for these EAR nations, they show decent stability in some areas. Economic management scores a 3.12 out of 6.
Right in the middle.
Trade ratings are actually pretty solid at 3.70. But then there is the glaring red flag. Transparency and accountability score the absolute lowest of all the metrics, sitting at just a 2.4.
And I would argue that 2.4 is the most dangerous metric in this entire 15-page report.
Really? Worse than 60% fossil fuel reliance, worse than a third of the workforce stuck in agriculture. What does a 2.4 in transparency actually look like on the ground?
I call this the leaky vessel.
The leaky vessel.
A demographic dividend, as massive as it is fundamentally fragile. It is a massive influx of capital and human energy, but it is incredibly easily wasted if the vessel holding it has leaks.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Let's look at a hypothetical example. A nation experiences the survival release. Families save money, banks accumulate capital, and the government takes out a massive loan to build a high-speed rail network to connect the rural waiting room to the urban density engine.
Sounds like a perfect demographic dividend investment.
Exactly, on paper. But with a transparency score of 2.4, what happens in reality? The bidding process for the rail network isn't public. The contract goes to the cousin of a minister.
Of course.
That contractor waters down the cement to skim profits. Ghost workers are added to the payroll. 30% of the capital simply vanishes into offshore accounts. The rail network takes twice as long to build, costs 3 times as much, and degrades within 5 years.
So the economic velocity is lost.
Entirely lost. The human capital isn't formed, the infrastructure fails, and the investments never reach the public. A 2.4 in transparency means the institutional plumbing of the country is fundamentally compromised.
That's depressing.
You can have all 3.55 billion people working incredibly hard, generating surplus wealth. But if the institutions managing that wealth are opaque and corrupt, the demographic capital is literally washed away in the rain. Good governance is the only institutional guarantee that a population dividend actually translates into a permanent wealth dividend.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. It all comes down to trust and execution. So, pulling all these diverse threads together, the $10 trillion in wealth, the massive megacities, the millions of farmers waiting for a factory job, the women locked out of the workforce by the paper promise, the rising CO2 emissions, and the leaky vessel of corruption.
It's a lot.
It's a ton. We reach the ultimate realization of this deep dive. A demographic dividend is not a permanent state of being. It is a temporary window.
Very temporary.
Which brings us to our final section. The window is closing. How do these nations ensure this once-in-a-century opportunity isn't wasted?
Well, we have to look at the explicit policy prescriptions the report outlines, based on all this empirical data, because the clock is ticking louder every year.
Let's summarize the stakes first. The EER regions hold immense, almost unfathomable growth potential. The foundational improvements in health and education prove that they are capable of massive systemic upgrades. The youths are healthier, more literate, and more urbanized than any generation before them.
Absolutely.
But the looming risks are severe. The gender-labor gap leaving half the talent on the table, the environmental pollution, and that frustratingly slow growth of per capita income.
The diagnosis of the symptoms is clear. The treatment, however, requires radical political will.
The report lays out 3 explicit, non-negotiable recommendations. Number 1, radically boost female labor participation. They have achieved the education parity. Now society has to build the structural bridges like childcare and safe transport to let them work. Number 2, push the energy transition toward green solutions, finding a way to decouple that $10 trillion economy from its 60% fossil fuel dependency before global carbon budgets force their hands. And number 3, deepen public sector accountability and transparency reforms. They have to fix that 2.4 CPIA score and patch the leaky vessel so the accumulated capital actually builds the future.
Those are the non-negotiables.
Yeah.
There is no alternative path to high income status without addressing all three.
So let's play this out. We call it a window of opportunity, which by definition means it is eventually going to close.
Yeah.
The birth rates will keep dropping, the life expectancy will keep rising, and the people will keep aging. What happens to these 3.55 billion people? What happens to these countries on a macro scale if they fail? If they don't fix the leaky vessel and integrate the women before their populations get old?
This is the critical takeaway of the entire analysis. An early demographic dividend is an opportunity, not a guarantee. It provides the fuel, but the country must build a functional engine to use it. If these policies aren't precisely and urgently executed, these countries face a devastating, historically proven economic trap. The phrase economists use for this failure condition is getting old before they get rich.
Getting old before they get rich. That is haunting.
Yeah.
Walk me through what that actually looks like for society.
Well, if they don't utilize this massive youthful workforce to accumulate vast permanent national wealth now, the math turns against them. In 30 or 40 years, that massive bulge of workers will retire.
Right.
They will cross the 65-year threshold. Suddenly, the elderly dependency ratio will skyrocket. But because they didn't fix the corruption, or they left the women out of the workforce, they didn't generate enough national wealth to build robust pension systems or advanced elderly care infrastructure.
So they transition straight from the burden of having too many impoverished youth directly into the burden of having too many impoverished elderly.
Precisely, without ever having achieved the high-income prosperity in the middle. The society becomes top-heavy with retirees who require expensive medical care, supported by a shrinking base of young workers who cannot bear the tax burden. The window will shut, and they will be locked outside the high-income club, potentially forever.
That is the incredibly perilous tightrope these nations are walking right now, and it affects all of us no matter where we live. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today.
I'm intrigued.
We often view booming populations in the developing world purely through the lens of local, isolated challenges. We read the news and wonder, how will they build enough roads? How will they create enough jobs? How will they manage their cities?
Right.
But consider the global mathematical reality. As the developed world, places like Europe, North America, and East Asia ages rapidly, birth rates in those regions are crashing. They are already facing desperate workforce shortages and straining tension systems.
It's becoming a crisis.
Exactly. This massive 3.5 billion strong population in the early dividend countries isn't just their own economic engine. Given the aging crisis in the West, these youth are likely going to become the primary demographic and economic engine for the entire planet.
That's a huge point.
Whether it is through massive global migration or the exponential rise of digital remote labor, the youth in these developing nations will inevitably end up producing the goods, providing the services, and ultimately supporting the aging populations of the developed world.
They are the future workforce.
They are. If you are listening to this from a Western country, the data we discussed today is essentially a crystal ball. It tells you exactly who will be manufacturing your goods, writing your software, and potentially caring for your elderly in 20 years.
Absolutely.
The question isn't just whether these ear nations can succeed for their own sake. The question is, will the global economy adapt fast enough to welcome them, partner with them, and help them keep the window open? Or will we keep the doors closed and watch the engine of the future stall out?
It's something we all need to be thinking about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the data. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll see you next time.